Before we go back to how all of this began, take a moment and tell us where you're watching from. If you're sitting in a small town, out on a farm road, or anywhere the weather still matters, leave your location and local time in the comments below. And if stories about ordinary people facing impossible odds still mean something to you, consider subscribing before we return to the spring when Ethan Mercer made a decision that nearly cost him everything. 8 months earlier, Mercer Farm looked like a place that time had forgotten. The farm sat along the edge of Mason Draw, a shallow valley several miles outside the town of Red Willow in western Kansas. It wasn't a large operation by local standards, just under 600 acres of corn, hay, and pasture land stretched across gently rolling ground that Ethan's family had worked for more than a century. The white farmhouse stood beneath an aging cottonwood tree, whose branches seemed to creak with old memories whenever the wind passed through them. The paint was peeling. One side of the porch sagged slightly. Several fence posts leaned at angles that bothered Ethan every time he looked at them. Fixing them always had to wait. Something more important always demanded attention. At 52 years old, Ethan Mercer carried the weight of the farm much the same way his father had before him. Quietly, without complaint, without expecting anyone to notice. Most mornings began before sunrise. Coffee, weather report, feed checks, equipment inspections. Then another day spent trying to stretch resources that never seemed to go quite far enough. The previous 3 growing seasons had been difficult. Rainfall totals continued shrinking. Fuel costs climbed. Equipment repairs seemed to arrive in clusters. Each year, the numbers became harder to balance. Each year, Ethan promised himself things would improve, and each year the margin for error became smaller. His son Luke had noticed. Luke Mercer lived in Wichita now, working for an agricultural supply company. At 28, he believed farming needed innovation, efficiency, and hard data. Whenever he visited, the conversations eventually drifted toward the same argument. "You can't keep doing things the way Grandpa did," Luke had told him during a visit that spring. Ethan hadn't answered immediately. Instead, he'd looked across the fields toward the western ridge where dark clouds were supposed to be gathering. The clouds never arrived. Neither did the rain. What Luke didn't fully understand was that Ethan wasn't trying to preserve old habits. He was trying to preserve the farm itself. There was a difference. The farm wasn't simply land. It was birthdays in the machine shed, Christmas dinners in the farmhouse kitchen, the marks carved into a barn beam showing 4 generations of children's heights. The sound of his late wife's laughter drifting across summer fields years earlier. Every acre carried a memory. Every memory carried a responsibility. One windy afternoon in early March, Ethan climbed into the loft above the old equipment shed, looking for spare fence wire. Instead, he found something else. A rusted metal box hidden beneath decades of dust. The hinges groaned when he opened it. Inside rested several yellowed papers, a worn leather notebook, and a folded map covered in hand-drawn markings. He recognized the handwriting instantly. It belonged to his grandfather. Ethan sat quietly on the wooden floorboards while dust floated through shafts of afternoon sunlight. Then he opened the notebook. The first pages contained weather records, rainfall measurements, planting dates, observations written in careful pencil. But halfway through the notebook, one sentence stopped him cold. A sentence underlined twice. A sentence that would refuse to leave his mind. Water never left this valley. Only people stopped looking. The sentence stayed with Ethan long after he climbed down from the loft. For several nights, the leather notebook sat open on his kitchen table beside a yellow lamp that had belonged to his grandmother. Outside, Spring winds rattled the windows while the old cottonwood scraped softly against the roof. Every evening after finishing chores, Ethan returned to the notebook. The more he read, the harder it became to dismiss. His grandfather, Walter Mercer, had never been a man given to exaggeration. He had recorded everything with the precision of a surveyor: rainfall totals, frost dates, crop yields, livestock counts, and scattered among those practical notes were repeated references to something called the Mason Draw Water Path. Not a creek, not a river, a water path. The phrase appeared dozens of times. Ethan unfolded the hand-drawn map and spread it across the kitchen table. A faded blue line curved through the valley and across several properties that no longer belonged to the same families. Small notes were written in the margins. Ground remains cool. Cottonwood roots reach water. Spring moisture survives dry years. Some of the markings pointed directly toward the massive cottonwood tree standing beside the farmhouse. Ethan stared through the window at the tree. For as long as he could remember, it had remained green even during dry summers. He had never questioned why. Now he wasn't so sure. The following week, he spent every spare hour walking the property. He carried the old map folded in his jacket pocket. The land still held traces of the past if someone knew where to look. Near the western pasture fence, he discovered several weathered wooden stakes barely visible above the soil. Most people would have mistaken them for broken fence posts, but the stakes appeared exactly where Walter's map said they would. Further downhill, Ethan found something else. The ground felt different. Even after several rainless weeks, patches of grass remained thicker and greener than surrounding areas. He knelt and pressed a hand against the earth. Cool. Much cooler than it should have been. A memory surfaced. He was 10 years old again, following Walter across these same fields. His grandfather had stopped near Mason Draw and pointed toward the valley floor. Most people look for water on the surface, Walter had said. They forget water has its own ways of traveling. At the time, Ethan had barely listened. Like most children, he assumed old stories would always be there waiting when he grew older. Now Walter had been gone nearly 20 years, and suddenly those forgotten words felt important. A few days later, Ethan drove into Red Willow and visited the county agricultural office. The receptionist directed him to a young technician who reviewed local groundwater surveys. The technician listened politely before shaking his head. There hasn't been any significant mapped water source in Mason Draw for decades. What about shallow underground flow? Ethan asked. The technician shrugged. If it's there, nobody has found evidence worth developing. Nobody. The word lingered in Ethan's mind all the way home. That evening, he spread Walter's map across the hood of his pickup and studied the contours of the land under the setting sun. The valley sloped exactly the way the notebook described, the old stakes aligned with the route. The cottonwood stood where Walter had marked a natural collection point. For the first time, Ethan saw something that felt less like a memory and more like a system. An old one. A forgotten one. Maybe even a workable one. The idea sounded ridiculous, which was probably why he kept thinking about it. The next morning, before Drought could return, Ethan called a local excavation company. By noon, bright orange flags marked a winding path across part of Mercer Farm. By sunset, neighbors had already started asking questions, and just after sunrise the following day, the first excavator lowered its bucket into the soil. The first few days attracted curiosity. The next few weeks attracted laughter. By the time the excavation company finished its portion of the work, nearly everyone in Red Willow had heard about Ethan Mercer's ditch. Some called it an irrigation project, others called it a midlife crisis. Most simply called it crazy. The ditch cut a winding path across part of Mercer Farm, following the exact route marked in Walter Mercer's faded notebook. Instead of running in straight lines like modern irrigation systems, it curved with the natural contours of the valley. To most people, it looked inefficient. To Ethan, it looked intentional. Unfortunately, he was nearly the only person who thought so. One afternoon at Calhoun Feed and Grain, several farmers stood near the coffee counter discussing spring planting conditions. The conversation stopped when Ethan entered. Then someone chuckled. "Heard you're digging rivers now." A few men laughed. Another shook his head. "Should have spent that money on a better well." Ethan continued pouring coffee. He said nothing. Years of farming had taught him that arguing rarely changed minds. Still, the comments followed him home. And sometimes they lingered longer than he wanted to admit. The excavation work had cost far more than expected. Several sections required additional grading. Erosion barriers had to be installed. Fuel prices climbed again. Every invoice seemed heavier than the last. When Luke visited in April, the tension between father and son finally surfaced. They stood beside the unfinished ditch while prairie winds swept across the valley. Luke looked at the fresh dirt bank stretching into the distance. "Dad, tell me honestly." Ethan kept his eyes on the ditch. "Honestly what? Do you really believe this is going to work?" The question hung between them. Ethan wanted to answer immediately. Instead, he hesitated. That hesitation told Luke everything. "You don't know," Luke said quietly. "No," Ethan admitted. "I don't." Luke sighed. Then why risk everything? Because he couldn't explain it. Not completely. How could he describe the feeling that the land itself was trying to tell a story everyone had forgotten? How could he explain trusting a notebook written by a man buried nearly 20 years ago? Some things sounded foolish when spoken aloud, especially to people who weren't there. A week later, Ethan sat inside the office of First Prairie Bank. The loan officer, Karen Whitmore, reviewed paperwork beneath fluorescent lights. Karen wasn't unkind. In fact, she had approved extensions for Ethan before, but numbers left little room for sentiment. "You've increased expenses significantly this year," Ethan nodded. Karen turned another page. "If yields don't improve, you're going to face serious cash flow issues by harvest." The words landed exactly where Ethan feared they would, because he already knew. Every sleepless night had reminded him. When the meeting ended, Karen handed him a folder. Inside was a formal warning outlining the farm's financial position. Not foreclosure. Not yet. But close enough to cast a shadow over everything. The drive home felt longer than usual. That evening, Ethan walked to the equipment shed where an old restored tractor sat beneath a canvas cover. A 1958 Farmall 560. His father's tractor. The machine had no practical value anymore. Modern equipment had replaced it years ago. Yet Ethan had spent countless weekends restoring it after his father's death. It was the one thing he had promised never to sell. He stood beside it for a long time. Long enough to know the answer before admitting it. 3 weeks later, the Farmall left Mercer Farm on a trailer. Neighbors noticed. Word spread quickly. Some took the sale as proof that Ethan's project was failing. Others quietly wondered how desperate things had become. The money kept construction moving. Barely. By early May, the ditch finally stretched from one end of the planned route to the other. Ethan climbed the bank and looked down its entire length. Months of work, months of risk, months of doubt. The ditch was complete, and completely dry. No trickle, no seepage, no sign of water anywhere. Only dust resting at the bottom of the channel. As sunset settled over Mason Draw, Ethan remained standing alone beside the empty ditch. For the first time since finding Walter's notebook, a question entered his mind that he could not push away. What if everyone else had been right? The ditch remained dry for 23 days. Ethan counted every one of them. At first, he told himself water simply needed time. The land had to settle. The channel had to find its balance. Walter's notes mentioned patience more than once, but patience became harder to hold on to when bills kept arriving, and when neighbors kept talking. By late May, the ditch had become something of a local joke. People pointed it out when driving past Mercer Farm. Some slowed down just to look. Others shook their heads. The worst part wasn't the laughter. It was the silence afterward. The silence that suggested people had stopped expecting anything from him. That hurt more than Ethan cared to admit. Meanwhile, the weather grew stranger. Storm systems appeared on forecasts and disappeared before reaching Red Willow County. Clouds gathered on distant horizons only to break apart under the relentless prairie wind. Week after week, the fields absorbed more heat and less rain. The early signs of drought were beginning to show. Most farmers responded the way modern farmers did. They relied on pumps, wells, monitoring systems, irrigation schedules, technology. Ethan had none of those advantages, only a dry ditch and an old notebook. One afternoon, he attended a county water management meeting held inside the Red Willow Community Center. The room was crowded. Farmers filled folding chairs while county officials reviewed seasonal projections. That was where Ethan first met Dr. Caleb Reeves. Caleb was a respected hydrologist hired by the county several years earlier. He was intelligent, professional, and known for making decisions based on hard data rather than tradition. During the presentation, maps flashed across a large screen. Groundwater levels, aquifer reports, projected rainfall deficits. The numbers were troubling. Afterward, someone mentioned Ethan's irrigation ditch. A few quiet chuckles spread through the room. Caleb looked toward Ethan. "I've heard about the project." His tone wasn't mocking. It was analytical, almost curious. Ethan nodded. Caleb folded his arms. "Have you conducted any groundwater testing?" "No." "Flow measurements?" "No." "Geological surveys?" Ethan shook his head again. Caleb hesitated before speaking. "I respect local knowledge. I truly do. But if you're relying on assumptions rather than measurable evidence, you're taking a significant risk." The room fell quiet. Nobody disagreed, because Caleb wasn't wrong. That was the problem. Everything he said sounded reasonable, scientific, responsible. For the first time since beginning the project, Ethan struggled to answer. When the meeting ended, he drove home with the windows down and the radio off. The prairie stretched endlessly beneath a fading orange sky. He barely noticed it. His thoughts kept returning to the same question. What if belief wasn't enough? That night he reopened Walter's notebook. He studied every page again, every note, every sketch, every faded observation. Near the back, he noticed something he had overlooked before. A rough elevation drawing of Mason Draw. Walter had marked a subtle slope running beneath the valley floor. Next to it, he had written, "Water. Slows here." Nothing more. No explanation. Just those 3 words. The drawing bothered Ethan. Not because he understood it. Because he didn't. The next morning, before sunrise, he walked the entire length of the ditch carrying a flashlight. At the lowest point near the cottonwood, he stopped. Something looked different. A patch of soil along the bank appeared darker than surrounding dirt. He crouched beside it. Touched it. Cool. Damp. His pulse quickened. He dug carefully with his hands. An inch below the surface, the earth was moist. Not soaked. Not muddy. But undeniably wet. For a long moment, Ethan simply stared. The drought had already begun. The surrounding ground should have been dry, yet moisture remained hidden beneath the soil. He looked down the ditch toward the distant hills, then back toward the cottonwood tree. For the first time in weeks, doubt loosened its grip. Somewhere beneath Mason Draw, something was moving. And just before dawn broke across the valley, a tiny bead of water emerged from the earth and slid slowly into the bottom of the ditch. The first trickle would have disappointed almost anyone else. To Ethan Mercer, it felt like a heartbeat. For several mornings after discovering the damp soil, he returned to the same spot before sunrise. Each day, a little more water appeared. Not enough to flow continuously. Not enough to irrigate a field, but enough to prove something important. Walter Mercer had not imagined it. Something beneath Mason Draw was feeding moisture into the valley. The problem was scale. A few drops of water could not save a farm. Ethan knew that better than anyone. So while most of Red Willow focused on planting and weather forecasts, he returned to work on the ditch. He widened sections of the channel, reinforced weak banks, adjusted slopes according to the old elevation sketches. Many evenings stretched well past sunset. The work left his shoulders aching and his hands blistered. Still, he kept going. Because for the first time, he could see evidence instead of hope alone. June arrived carrying heat that seemed to settle over the county like a heavy blanket. Pastures began fading. Creek beds shrank. Dust followed every passing vehicle. Weather reports grew increasingly grim. Meteorologists spoke of expanding drought conditions across western Kansas. Few people panicked. Not yet. Farmers had seen dry years before. Most believed rain would eventually return. Ethan wasn't so sure. One afternoon, while repairing a section of ditch near the western pasture, he noticed an old pickup truck parked beside the road. An elderly man climbed out. It was Harold Jennings. At 81 years old, Harold was one of the oldest farmers still living in the county. He approached slowly, leaning on a cane. For a while, neither man spoke. Harold simply studied the ditch. Then he nodded toward the valley. "Haven't seen anyone working that route in 60 years. Ethan looked up. "What route?" Harold pointed with the tip of his cane. "The old water line." The words caught Ethan completely off guard. "You've heard of it?" Harold laughed softly. "Heard of it, son. My grandfather used to talk about it." Ethan set down his shovel. For the next hour, the two men sat beneath the shade of the cottonwood tree. Harold spoke about stories passed through generations. Long before modern wells, some families had relied on natural underground flow patterns that followed the valley. Nothing formal, nothing engineered. Just observations gathered over decades. Most people stopped paying attention after pumps became common. The knowledge slowly disappeared. Folks started trusting machines more than land, Harold said. Ethan thought about Walter's notebook. The wooden stakes, the cool patches of soil, the strange slope marked on the map. Each clue seemed a little less isolated now, a little more connected. Before leaving, Harold paused beside the ditch. "You know," he said, "there used to be a saying around here." "What saying?" Harold smiled. "Mason draw never dries first." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. The sentence echoed in Ethan's mind for days. As June turned into July, the drought tightened its grip. Temperatures climbed past 100 degrees. Fields across the county began showing stress. Corn leaves curled. Hay production dropped. Water demand increased everywhere. Yet something unexpected was happening on Mercer Farm. Near the lower section of the ditch, a portion of Ethan's corn remained noticeably greener. Not perfect, not miraculous, just healthier than surrounding acreage. Enough for people to notice. Enough for whispers to begin replacing jokes. Ethan stood at the edge of the field one evening, watching the breeze move through rows of green stalks. The sight filled him with cautious hope. But hope came with its own danger, because one green field would attract attention, and attention had a way of bringing questions. The next morning, county officials issued an emergency drought advisory for Red Willow County. The worst forecasts had finally become reality, and according to every projection, the hardest weeks were still ahead. By the middle of July, drought was no longer a forecast. It was reality. The hills around Red Willow County had lost their color. Pastures that normally carried cattle through late summer turned brittle beneath relentless heat. Dust drifted across county roads in long brown clouds, and every conversation in town eventually circled back to the same subject: water, or more accurately, the lack of it. At Calhoun Feed and Grain, farmers compared well levels the way previous generations had compared rainfall. Every report seemed worse than the last. 3 feet lower, 5 feet lower, 7 feet lower. The numbers spread anxiety through the community. Even people who rarely worried about weather were beginning to pay attention. Mercer Farm, however, presented an uncomfortable mystery. The ditch was no longer dry. A narrow but steady stream now moved through portions of the channel. Nothing dramatic, nothing spectacular. Yet enough water flowed each day to keep several sections of Ethan's corn alive while neighboring fields struggled. People noticed, and as conditions worsened, curiosity slowly transformed into suspicion. One afternoon, Ethan arrived at his mailbox to find tire tracks leading into the edge of his property. Someone had driven out during the night. The tracks followed the ditch for nearly half a mile. Whoever had come wasn't simply looking. They had been investigating. The realization left Ethan uneasy. A week later, rumors began spreading through town. Some claimed Ethan had discovered a hidden spring. Others insisted he had tapped into a restricted groundwater source. A few suggested he was diverting water illegally from neighboring land. The stories grew more elaborate with each retelling. None were true. But truth often moved slower than fear. The tension finally reached county officials. One hot afternoon, a white county truck rolled into Mercer Farm. Dr. Caleb Reeves stepped out. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 water management inspectors accompanied him. Ethan met them beside the ditch. The air shimmered with heat. Corn leaves rustled weakly in the distance. For several minutes, the inspectors examined the channel, took photographs, and recorded measurements. Caleb remained professional, respectful, even. But there was concern in his expression. "We've received complaints," he said. Ethan crossed his arms. About what? Possible unauthorized water diversion. The accusation felt like a punch to the chest. "I haven't diverted anything." "I'm not saying you have," Caleb paused, "but with current drought conditions, we have a responsibility to verify where the water is coming from." Ethan understood the reasoning. That didn't make it easier. For hours they walked the property. They checked boundaries, inspected drainage patterns, reviewed maps. In the end, the inspectors found no evidence of wrongdoing. Yet they also found no clear explanation. That uncertainty created a problem of its own, because unanswered questions rarely stay quiet. The investigation became public knowledge within days. Suddenly, people who had once laughed at Ethan now looked at him differently. Not with admiration, with doubt. The green sections of Mercer Farm no longer seemed lucky. They seemed suspicious. Even Luke called from Wichita. "Dad, what's going on?" Ethan could hear concern in his son's voice. "I don't know. You think somebody's trying to make trouble?" Ethan looked across the valley. Maybe. Or maybe desperate people simply needed someone to blame. As July slipped toward August, conditions deteriorated even further. Several farms reported severe crop losses. Emergency meetings filled county calendars. Water restrictions expanded. And still the ditch carried its quiet stream through Mercer Farm. Then one morning, Ethan stepped outside and immediately knew something was wrong. The flow looked weaker. Much weaker. He climbed into his truck and followed the ditch toward the western edge of the property. A quarter-mile later, his stomach dropped. One entire section of the bank had been deliberately destroyed. Fresh shovel marks scarred the earth. A pile of collapsed soil blocked the channel. Water pooled uselessly behind the damage. Someone had come during the night. And this time, they hadn't come to look. They had come to stop the water. For a long moment, Ethan simply stood there staring at the damage. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon, yet heat already shimmered above the valley floor. Water backed up behind the collapsed section of ditch, spilling uselessly into the weeds instead of continuing toward the fields that needed it. Someone had done this deliberately. The shovel marks made that painfully clear. Ethan climbed down into the ditch and began moving dirt by hand. Not because it would solve the problem, because he didn't know what else to do. By noon, sweat soaked through his shirt. His back ached. The drought-stricken fields stretched around him like a reminder that time was running out. And for the first time since opening Walter's notebook, exhaustion began to outweigh determination. What if this was where the story ended? Not with failure because the ditch didn't work, but because people refused to let it. That evening he sat alone on the farmhouse porch beneath the old cottonwood tree. The same tree Walter had marked on the map. The same tree that seemed greener than everything around it. The wind barely moved. The valley was silent. Ethan looked toward the fields and thought about the tractor he had sold, the money he had spent, the months he had sacrificed, the trust he had strained with Luke. Maybe everyone had been right about one thing. Maybe he had become too stubborn. The thought stayed with him long after darkness settled over Mercer Farm. Then headlights appeared at the end of the driveway. A pickup truck rolled slowly toward the house. Ethan recognized it immediately. Luke. His son stepped out carrying a duffel bag. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Luke walked onto the porch. "I took vacation time." Ethan frowned. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not." Luke sat down in the empty chair beside him. "But I figured somebody should help." The words struck Ethan harder than he expected, because they carried no argument, no criticism, no lecture, only support. The next morning, father and son began repairing the damaged section together. The work was slow, heavy, unpleasant, but it gave them something they had not shared in a long time: a common purpose. During breaks, Luke studied Walter's notebook. He examined the hand-drawn maps with growing interest. Unlike before, he no longer dismissed them outright. One afternoon, he stopped beside several weathered wooden stakes protruding from the ground. The same stakes Ethan had discovered months earlier. "There are too many of these," Luke said, "for what? To be random." That observation led them to re-examine the entire route shown on Walter's map. For 2 days they walked property lines, compared landmarks, and studied old county records available online. What they found surprised both of them. Several of the wooden stakes aligned with survey references dating back nearly 70 years. Not irrigation equipment. Boundary markers. Historical markers. Evidence that something had once existed here. Luke dug deeper. At the county archives in Red Willow, he requested old land use documents and forgotten engineering surveys. Most contained little useful information. Then, late on a Thursday afternoon, a clerk handed him a dusty folder that had not been opened in decades. Inside was a folded map, far older than Walter's notebook. Luke carefully unfolded it across a table. His pulse quickened. Blue lines crossed Mason Draw. Not one. Several. Handwritten notes identified seasonal water channels, underground seep zones, and natural collection areas used by early settlers before modern irrigation systems became common. The routes matched Walter's drawings almost perfectly. When Luke returned home that evening, Ethan was repairing erosion barriers near the ditch. Without a word, Luke handed him the map. Ethan studied it beneath the fading sunlight. For several seconds, neither spoke, because both understood what they were looking at. Proof. Not complete proof. Not enough to silence everyone, but enough to show Walter's knowledge had been built on something real, something documented, something larger than memory. As darkness settled across Mason Draw, Ethan rolled up the map and looked toward the valley. The drought was still worsening. The investigation remained unresolved, and someone had already tried to destroy the ditch once. But now they possessed something they had never had before: evidence. The question was whether it would be enough when the county finally demanded answers. August arrived without mercy. For 53 consecutive days, measurable rain failed to reach Red Willow County. Fields that had survived early summer finally began surrendering to the heat. Corn leaves curled tightly against their stalks. Hay yields collapsed. Livestock producers hauled water from neighboring counties whenever they could afford the fuel. Everywhere Ethan looked, the land seemed to be holding its breath. And still, Mason Draw remained different. Not untouched, not thriving, but alive. The ditch carried a steady flow now, stronger than anything Ethan had seen since beginning the project. Water moved quietly through the winding channel, feeding portions of Mercer Farm while surrounding fields faded into shades of brown and gray. The contrast had become impossible to ignore. By the second week of August, county officials scheduled a public review of the ongoing water investigation. Word spread quickly. Farmers came because they wanted answers. Officials came because they needed them. And some came simply because they wanted to witness the outcome of a controversy that had divided the community for months. The meeting took place outdoors on Mercer Farm. The drought had become too severe to ignore the evidence sitting in front of everyone. Rows of damaged crops stretched across neighboring properties. Yet behind Ethan stood a section of green corn still swaying beneath the prairie wind. Not perfect, but undeniably alive. Shortly after sunrise, county vehicles arrived. Inspectors stepped out carrying clipboards and surveying equipment. Dr. Caleb Reeves followed close behind. Unlike their earlier meetings, there was no skepticism in his expression now, only determination. He wanted the truth as badly as anyone else. More than 50 people gathered near the ditch. Some were neighbors, some were reporters from nearby counties. Others were farmers who had once laughed openly when construction began. Now they stood quietly beneath the relentless Kansas sun. The inspection started at the upper end of Mason Draw. Ethan and Luke presented Walter's notebook, the historical maps, the archived survey records. Inspectors compared landmarks, measured elevations, checked locations of the wooden stakes. One by one, the scattered clues began fitting together. The cottonwood tree, the cooler soil zones, the ancient survey markers, the unusual slope recorded in Walter's notebook, the forgotten water routes shown on historical maps. Nothing alone proved much. Together, they told a story the land itself had been preserving for generations. Hours passed. Temperatures climbed. The crowd followed as inspectors traced the route of the ditch deeper into the valley. At one point, Caleb stopped and studied a section of exposed soil. He crouched beside it, ran his hand across the earth, then compared it against geological notes in the historical survey. For several seconds he said nothing. When he finally stood, something had changed in his face. The pieces were beginning to align. By late afternoon, the group approached the lowest section of the system near the cottonwood tree. This was where Walter's notebook had marked the strongest concentration of underground flow. This was where the moisture first appeared. This was where the entire theory would either stand or collapse. The crowd gathered along the ditch banks. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed quieter. Inspectors positioned monitoring equipment while Caleb reviewed measurements one final time. Ethan stood beside Luke. Months of doubt, months of ridicule, months of sacrifice. Everything had led to this moment. Then one of the inspectors looked up. "Dr. Reeves," he called. Caleb walked over. The inspector pointed toward a set of readings displayed on a handheld monitor. Several officials leaned in. Expressions changed. Questions were exchanged in hushed voices. People shifted nervously. No announcement came. Not yet. Instead, Caleb slowly turned and looked down the final stretch of the ditch toward the cottonwood tree. Then he looked back at Ethan. For the first time since they had met, there was no disagreement between them, only realization. Because somewhere beneath Mason Draw, the land was revealing exactly what Walter Mercer had tried to describe decades earlier. And now all that remained was proving it to everyone else. The answer came just before sunset. After hours of measurements, comparisons, and field inspections, the crowd gathered near the old cottonwood tree at the lowest point of Mason Draw. The heat remained brutal. Dust drifted across distant fields. Beyond Mercer Farm, thousands of acres of struggling crops stretched toward the horizon. Yet here, water continued moving through the ditch. Steady, quiet, persistent. Dr. Caleb Reeves stood beside a folding table covered with maps, notebooks, and survey reports. For several moments he reviewed the final data while farmers waited in uneasy silence. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered. They simply watched. At last, Caleb removed his glasses and looked across the crowd. "We've completed the investigation. his voice carried easily through the still evening air. The water flowing through this ditch is not being diverted from neighboring properties. A murmur spread through the gathering. Caleb continued. It is also not the result of any unauthorized pumping system. The crowd grew even quieter. Several county officials exchanged glances. Farmers leaned forward. Caleb picked up one of the historical maps Luke had found. Then he held up Walter Mercer's notebook. What we appear to have here is evidence of a naturally occurring subsurface water movement pattern that has existed beneath Mason Draw for generations. The words seemed to settle over the valley. Many people didn't fully understand the science. They understood the meaning. Ethan had not stolen water. He had found it. Or rather, rediscovered it. Caleb walked toward the cottonwood tree. His boots crunched softly against dry grass. This valley contains a series of shallow underground flow channels that slow and collect seasonal groundwater movement. He pointed toward the ditch. Mr. Mercer aligned his project almost perfectly with those natural pathways. A reporter raised a hand. How accurate are we talking? Caleb glanced at the maps, then at Ethan. Remarkably accurate. The statement carried more weight than anyone expected, because it came from the one person who had questioned the project most consistently. Not out of malice, out of responsibility. And now the evidence had forced him to change his conclusion. For Ethan, that mattered. More than applause ever could. The crowd slowly dispersed into smaller conversations. Questions replaced accusations. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Several farmers approached Ethan directly. Some wanted advice. Others wanted explanations. A few simply wanted to shake his hand. Then something unexpected happened. An older farmer named Rick Holloway stepped forward. Months earlier, he had been one of the loudest voices mocking the ditch at Calhoun Feed and Grain. Now he stood awkwardly beside the channel. I owe you an apology. Ethan looked surprised. Rick rubbed the back of his neck. I figured you'd wasted your money. A few nearby farmers chuckled quietly. Rick didn't. I was wrong. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. In a farming community, public admissions rarely came easily. Ethan nodded. Wouldn't be the first time somebody thought I was wrong. The tension finally broke. Several people laughed. Even Ethan. For the first time in months. As evening settled across Mason Draw, Caleb approached him privately. The hydrologist carried a folder beneath one arm. I spent most of this summer trying to prove your theory couldn't work. Ethan smiled faintly. And Caleb looked toward the valley. I think your grandfather understood something modern surveys overlooked. The statement lingered between them. Then Caleb added something Ethan would remember for years. Knowledge doesn't stop being valuable just because it's old. For a moment, neither man spoke. The cottonwood leaves rustled softly above them. Water moved through the ditch below. The sound was almost gentle, almost peaceful. Yet the victory carried a cost. The Farmall tractor was gone. The debt remained. Part of the harvest had already been lost before the water reached enough acreage, and no amount of recognition could recover the months of strain placed on his family. Still, as Ethan looked across the surviving fields, he understood something important. The farm would make it through the year? Barely. But it would survive. And in a season when survival itself had become uncertain, that was enough. Yet one final test remained, because the drought had not ended, and the hardest weeks of summer were still ahead. The drought finally broke on a cold September afternoon. Not with a violent storm, not with thunder rolling across the plains, just a steady rain that began before sunrise and continued through the night. By then, much of Red Willow County had already suffered losses that would take years to recover from. Some farms harvested only a fraction of what they had planted. Others survived by refinancing debt or selling equipment. A few families quietly decided it would be their last season farming altogether. The rain arrived too late to save many fields, but it arrived soon enough to remind people that droughts, like all hard seasons, eventually pass. Mercer Farm survived. Barely. The ditch had preserved enough acreage to keep the operation afloat, not enough to produce a record harvest, not enough to erase Ethan's debt, but enough. Enough to make loan payments, enough to plant another year, enough to keep the farm in the family. And after everything that had happened, enough felt like a blessing. Autumn spread across Mason Drought in shades of gold and amber. Combines rolled through surviving fields. Dust gave way to fallen leaves. The cottonwood tree beside the farmhouse turned brilliant yellow before scattering its leaves across the yard. One evening, Ethan stood beneath its branches watching the sunset paint the valley in soft orange light. The ditch remained visible from where he stood, a winding line crossing the land exactly as Walter had drawn it decades earlier. For the first time, Ethan understood that the ditch itself had never been the real story. The real story was memory, knowledge, attention, the willingness to notice things others stopped seeing. A few weeks later, the county invited Ethan to attend a regional water management meeting. Farmers from neighboring counties arrived to hear about Mason Drought. Some expected a miracle. Ethan disappointed them immediately. There isn't one. A few people laughed. He continued, "The land won't tell everybody the same thing." The room grew quiet. You have to learn your own ground. That was the lesson Walter had passed down. Not instructions. Observation. Patience. Respect. No one left with a blueprint for copying Mercer Farm, but many left thinking differently about the places they called home. Luke stayed through harvest, then through winter planning, then longer. One afternoon, he surprised Ethan with an announcement. "I think I'm coming back." Ethan looked up from the kitchen table. Back where? Luke smiled. Home. The answer settled into the room more gently than either expected. The farm still faced challenges. Repairs remained unfinished. Debt still hung over the operation. Nothing had magically become easy. Yet something important had changed. The future no longer felt like something slipping away. Months later, during a county conservation project, workers installed a small historical marker near Mason Drought. The plaque was simple. It recognized the valley's early agricultural water routes and the generations of farmers who had documented them. Walter Mercer's name appeared among them. So did Ethan's. When the dedication ceremony ended, most people returned to their lives, which was exactly how Ethan preferred it. He never became famous, never appeared on national television, never built a business around his discovery. He continued doing what he had always done, waking before sunrise, checking fields, watching weather, trying to leave the land a little better than he found it. Sometimes visitors stopped by to see the ditch. Most expected something impressive. Instead, they found a narrow channel of water winding quietly through a Kansas valley. Nothing spectacular. Nothing dramatic. Just a reminder. The land had been speaking all along. Someone had simply chosen to listen. And on certain evenings, when the sun settled low over Mason Drought and the water reflected the colors of the sky, Ethan could almost imagine Walter standing beside him once again, not saying a word, just smiling toward the valley, as if he had known from the beginning that one day somebody would finally understand. There are stories about winning, and then there are stories about enduring. Ethan Mercer never became the richest farmer in Kansas. He never discovered hidden treasure. He never found an easy answer to the problems facing rural communities. What he found was something quieter, something that often disappears when the world starts moving too fast. He found value in paying attention, in remembering, in respecting knowledge that didn't come from a screen, a report, or a machine, but from years spent walking the same ground and learning its patterns. The people of Red Willow County didn't suddenly become different people. The drought still hurt. Farms were still lost. Debt didn't disappear overnight. Life kept moving, just as it always does. But when the next dry season arrived, more farmers began asking questions about their own land. More families opened old notebooks. More people listened when an older neighbor shared a story that sounded outdated at first. Maybe that's how real change happens, not all at once. One conversation at a time, one memory at a time, one person willing to look where everyone else stopped looking. If this story meant something to you, we'd love to hear your thoughts below. Have you ever known someone like Ethan? Someone who kept going even when everyone around them doubted them? Have you ever heard an old piece of advice that turned out to be right years later? And if you haven't already, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. If you enjoy stories about rural life, family farms, perseverance, forgotten wisdom, and ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges, consider liking the video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing to follow along for more stories like this. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of the people around you, and never underestimate the value of something simply because it's old. Sometimes the oldest lessons are the ones that survive the longest.